Welcome to the College Neuro Network, a podcast series part of Simply Neuroscience's The Synapse. My name is Sarah.
And my name is Sasha, and we're your hosts for today. The College Neuro Network has discussions with undergraduate students studying neuroscience and neuroscience professors in order to gain insight into the neuroscience department and opportunities in the nation's top universities. Today's episode is unique in that we'll be covering information from two rather than one university.
This installment focuses on both Yale and Johns Hopkins University, both known for their strengths in research opportunities, passionate and innovative student bodies, and their rank as among the top 10 universities by the U.S. News and World Report.
Today, joining us is Dr. Dae-Yo Lee, a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Neuroscience and Psychological and Brain Studies at Johns Hopkins University and Professor Adjunct of Neuroscience at Yale University. Welcome, Dr. Lee. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss your experiences at both Yale and Johns Hopkins.
Well, thanks for having me.
So our first question is if you can please briefly introduce yourself and kind of describe your current positions at both universities.
Right. So I'm currently a professor in two different departments at Johns Hopkins University, Department of Neuroscience and Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences. And I'm honored to actually have this position called Bloomberg Distinguished Professor, which was created by relatively large donation by Bloomberg a few years ago. And I think we are up to about 50 Bloomberg distinguished professors at Johns Hopkins University that span actually all fields. And one of the requirements is that each of these professors is supposed to have appointments in two different departments in two different schools. So they're expected to play a role in bridging different departments and different disciplines. And so for me, this actually fits my research quite well because I study neural mechanisms of decision-making using diverse approaches. Some are borrowed from psychology, some are borrowed from economics, and of course, neuroscience is based upon many techniques in biology, but I also draw from computer science, such as AI. And Hopkins actually has a strong traditions in all of these disciplines. So I'm excited to actually come to Hopkins about a year ago. Before that, I was at Yale for 13 years in the Department of Neuroscience, which was a part of the medical school, and I was doing research there for a long time.
That's amazing. So our next question is, what sparked your initial interest in neuroscience?
So I think I was originally interested in when I was a teenager, about your age. I was very interested in philosophy and psychology because I think we, as we sort of develop our self-awareness, I think the first question that a lot of us ask is basically, who am I, where we came from, what determines my preference, and what am I supposed to do? And that, for some people that naturally leads to readings in philosophy and psychology, because those are the two disciplines that are trying to provide a lot of answers to these fundamental questions. But I was getting confused because it was, the books were very difficult to understand. Even if because I was doing this in mostly self-study. I was not taking courses in, colleges, or wasn't talking to philosophy professors or anything like that. And I wasn't sure as to whether, I was understanding things correctly or not. But then when I went to college, when I actually started taking classes in psychology, I became more familiar with the experimental methods. So if you want to have a more objective sort of, shareable knowledge, then there is a alternative approach, which is actually to, try to do experiments. And one of those experimental methods, obviously, is try to understand how the brain works, because what we think of as a mental phenomena, including the questions about, self-identities and things like that, obviously are functions of our brain. So that's how I got interested in neuroscience.
Great, that's amazing to hear. Since both me and Sarah are high schoolers, it's always so fascinating to hear how different people get interested in neuroscience from like a very young age. Okay, so our next question for you is, can you talk a little bit about your day-to-day life as a professor and what some of your responsibilities look like right now?
Right. So I think one of the really attractive things about being a professor as a profession is the fact that actually you have a lot of ability to control your time because you're spending a lot of time doing research on the topic that you can actually select. And therefore, you have a lot of freedom in terms of creating your schedules and deciding what experiments you want to do, what kind of people did you want to. Obviously, that's the area that I spend most of my time. These days, I do that remotely because, like many of us, so we're still limited to staying home. Before COVID, for example, I would be in my office interacting with other people in the lab, supervising their experiments and things like that. That's the most important activity for me. When I was at Yale, I had very relatively limited interaction with the undergraduate students because medical school doesn't have a significant body of undergrad sort of classes, or they don't interact with the undergraduate students too much. So I was way more focusing on doing research. I would occasionally give guest lectures and courses that are taught in Department of Psychology and so on, but I would mostly spend most of my time in the medical school. Here, because my positions are in part in the medical school, so at Hopkins, neuroscience department is in the medical school, psychological and brain sciences in the School of Arts and Sciences. So I'm actually preparing a lecture on the evolution of intelligence, which will be given to the undergrad students next year. So I'm quite excited about that too.
Wow, that sounds really exciting. Yeah, for sure. And so kind of our next question for you is like diving more into your experience as a professor. So we wanted to ask what drew you specifically to becoming a professor at Yale, and then what kind of motivated you to also take this position at Johns Hopkins?
So that's a difficult question because getting a faculty position in any university, but especially in research universities, it has become, I think it was always competitive, but I think the perception is that it has become hyper competitive in the recent years because the research activity has become very industrialized, right? So I think that there's a worry that we might be training too many students that want to become full-time researchers in universities. And of course, the number of positions in research universities is limited. So I have very limited ability, just like many other people, almost everybody doesn't actually have the ability to choose one particular university that you like to go to. I won't name any university, but if you wanted to go to University A, for example, in a particular state, the chance of that opportunity opening up is practically zero. I don't think you should count on it. So what you do is that you sort of gradually develop your specific research interest. I think that I strongly believe that you should do research that most excites you, and then look around the world and see actually whether that's there's a recognition and consensus that problem is important. And of course, if you're truly excited about what you're doing, there's a good chance that there are a lot of people that share that excitement. And also it's likely that that's an important problem, because otherwise, why would you get excited in the first place? And therefore, if you then sort of make good progress and come up with some novel ideas that other people can recognize, then opportunity starts opening up. And then, once you get, sometimes you have one opportunity. So my first faculty position, when I got my first faculty position at Wake Forest University many years ago, I had only one offer. So I had no choice. That was the only opportunity available to me at the time. But then once you sort of have your position, then sometimes you could consider moving to another university when such opportunity become available. And I went to Yale because Yale, as you mentioned in the beginning, Yale's one of the universities in the U.S. that have probably one of the strongest emphasis in neuroscience research. There are many wonderful colleagues that I could interact with and learn from, and also has a really good student body, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. So those are the main considerations when you have multiple choices, when you're lucky enough to actually multiple options, or when you have an opportunity to move. And it's exactly the same reason that I came to Hopkins. I don't want to say which university is better. I think both of those are wonderful, but the main reason that I actually could move was because of the Bloomberg distinguished professorship that was made available to me. So that was very exciting, and I was honored to have that opportunity.
Great, yeah, that's a very incredible and very impressive journey to take. And so kind of you already touched on this a little bit, how Yale is very strong in neuroscience research, as well as a very strong student body. We were wondering if you could elaborate on what you think personally makes Johns Hopkins Neuroscience Department and Yale's Neuroscience Department different from other top universities.
So they're both really strong in that they have a huge program. So it covers all levels and all areas of neuroscience very well. That's true for both Yale and Johns Hopkins. And I'd like to focus on actually what was particularly attractive to me at Hopkins. And that's where I am. One thing that was kind of exciting and interesting to me was that when I started considering the possibility of moving to Hopkins, so I have three kind of official mentors, right? So I had a mentor who was a neuroscientist when I was an undergrad student. Then I have a PhD advisor that I did my dissertation with. And then you guys may know this, but once you get your PhD, you could also, most people these days who want to stay in academia also do something called postdoctoral research. So you get a little more, additional training, sometimes short, sometimes it could be as long as your PhD research. And it turns out that both my PhD advisor and my postdoctoral mentor were trained at Hopkins. So Hopkins has a very strong tradition in the specific area that I work on, which is referred to as a systems neuroscience, which means that you're trying to understand different systems of the brain and their functions and structures, such as like visual system, motor system, or memory, rather than focusing on something very much more microscopic, like particular receptors or particular molecules or transmitters and things like that. And I was obviously more interested in the systems neuroscience because, as I mentioned in the beginning, I was drawn to neuroscience because I was sort of interested in these big questions, relatively speaking, big question for neuroscientists, because neuroscience really spans everything from molecules to brain evolution. It covers very broad time scales and spatial scales. And I'm a systems neuroscience, and Hopkins is really, really strong in that area.
Great, yeah. Just adding on to what you were saying about how interdisciplinary neuroscience is, kind of transitioning over to class structure. How does Yale and Johns Hopkins balance how classes are run? Are they more lecture-based or discussion-based? And what is the balance like to address that interdisciplinary aspect of neuroscience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a hard problem because I think different universities handle this differently, because it's still the case that so for example, at Yale, they created a neuroscience major only a few years ago, whereas at Hopkins, neuroscience major is probably the largest or one of the largest majors for undergrad students. So does that mean that undergrad students at Yale are not getting any training? We're not getting any training in neuroscience? No, because neuroscience consists of many different subdisciplines, right? So you can study the brain by studying its anatomy. You can study physiology. You can study evolution. You can study molecular basis of signal transduction. There are many, many things you can do. And some people actually object to having neuroscience major for undergraduate students because they think that it encourages undergraduate students to become too myopic, because they're going to start focusing on one specific areas rather than getting broad trainings even outside neuroscience, such as like physics and computer science and psychology. And obviously, I didn't have any formal training in neuroscience as an undergraduate student. So there's a debate. So universities vary, and there's a spectrum of how much explicit focus the schools have on training undergraduate students as a neuroscientist, quote. And I think that you shouldn't be, if you're thinking about choosing which university to go to, and if you had already decided or already have a lot of interest in neuroscience, I don't think that it's too critical for you to go to a school that has a huge neuroscience department for undergraduate students. Because I think what's more important is, because you're at the end of your 4 years of undergraduate education, you will not become a fully licensed neuroscientist, right? There's just too much stuff that you have to learn. And therefore, I think it's probably more important to go to a program where you could actually get a solid training and education in the disciplines that are more specifically related to the kind of neuroscience research you want to do. So if you want to be, somebody who sort of, can go back and forth freely between AI research and neuroscience, then you might want to go to a school that has both a strong tradition in computer science and neuroscience, for example. Or if you want to become someone who's more interested in, molecular science or, neuroscience that deals with specific disease, then maybe going to a place where there's a good, medical school and a good biology department might be useful. So I think it all depends on the kind of neuroscience that you're interested in.
So both me and Sarah are planning to study neuroscience in some way, shape, or form when we go to college. So it's very interesting to hear that there are a lot of nuances between neuroscience departments at different universities. It's very important to look into what you are really interested in and see which one's best fit for you.
One more thing that I'd like to add is that regardless of what kind of neuroscience you want to do, I think that having a strong quantitative skills is extremely important these days. This is a gradual change that's been going on for several decades that I've been in the field, that the technology is advancing at an amazing rate. And that's making it easier and easier for researchers to get huge amount of data quickly. And the person who actually has a good quantitative, computational skills, who can process those data and then, extract information that's useful to test different theories about how the brain works, I think actually will have a huge advantage. They do already. So this is something to keep in mind.
Got it. And just to add on to what you were saying, would you say that's more of like computational neuroscience and statistics classes? Is that what you're talking about?
That's relevant too. But then if you're interested in those kinds of neuroscience, you're gonna get a lot of training, during your undergraduate and graduate training. But in order to be able to study those materials, you definitely need a solid background in math, right? This is what I was talking about earlier, that some professors actually think that it's more important for undergrad students to spend more time in studying math and physics and get more foundational sort of training before getting into, for example, specific algorithms that might be applied to, some areas of in the brain, for example. Because your interest might change. You might be interested in vision right now, but you might become more interested in the motor control later, which is what happened to me. I studied vision when I was a graduate student, but now I study decision making. So it helps because how the visual cortex works obviously will give you some insights about how other parts of the brain work as well. But what's more important is that in both of those areas, you're going to use a lot of math to understand how things work at a more abstract level.
Got it. Great. That's very interesting to hear. I've never heard that perspective before, so that's very insightful. And then, so our next question for you is kind of at, the same discussion with classes. So you're wondering if you could talk about what your favorite class was to teach so far.
Well, as I said, I didn't teach a lot of courses when I was at Yale. But before I went to Yale, I was at the University of Rochester. So I was another stop between Wake Forest and Yale. And at that time, I was in the college. I was in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was teaching upper level undergraduate classes on something called sensory and motor systems. And that was, of course, the only course that I was teaching to undergrads, and therefore that was my favorite. I gave sort of, occasional lectures to undergrads when I was at Yale. So I don't think I could point to a particular class that I was teaching. And I like to make the course that I'm preparing to teach next year at Hopkins my favorite, because even though it's going to focus on the brain evolution, it's actually, I'd like to cover these neighboring disciplines that I mentioned. In other words, I'd like to sort of discuss with the students as to what's the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence. Is there something that can inform future AI from the knowledge that we're developing in humans? And are we unique? And what do other animals have intelligence? How do we evaluate them? Is the intelligence unique to animals? Do plants have any intelligence? How can we recognize alien intelligence? And these are the questions that have always fascinated me, and I'd like to sort of do that with the undergraduate students.
So we wanted to also talk a little bit about your book, Birth of Intelligence from RNA to Artificial Intelligence, which is targeted at science-oriented high school and college students and explores questions such as, does a high level of biological intelligence require complex brain, and is AI fundamentally different from human intelligence?
Right.
So first, can you please kind of briefly explain the general topics that your book covers?
Right. Well, thanks for introducing my book.
Yeah.
So this book was very ambitious, and in fact, that's why I decided to write a book rather than writing as a article, because I knew from the very beginning that, you know, since I'm one person who's trying to write a book on so many different things, that I wouldn't be able to cover it at the level of rigor that's expected for peer-reviewed scientific publications, for example. But the book really wanted to link everything that I find interesting in our universe, from how the life originated and what's the relationship between life and intelligence, and does AI have real intelligence? How is it going to be different? Is it different from human intelligence? So it actually introduces very diverse perspectives about how we can go about understanding human intelligence and brains. So it has chapters on AI, something called principal-agent relationship, which deals with, you know, how you can efficiently set up division of labors between different entities, and, you know, how the principal who's actually driving the contract with another agent in order to create a productive sort of division of labor system, how that principal could actually instruct the agent so that the division remains productive. So the reason why this is an important issue is because as life form gets more and more complicated, division of labors occurs repeatedly. So I'm arguing in the book that, for example, you can consider brain evolution as a way for genes to create its agents so that it can solve the problems that life form faces more effectively. And the same thing is true for AI and humans as well. So we're creating AIs so that they can deal with the problems that humans face more effectively. Sort of, it's very similar to why the brains evolved in the first place. So I'm trying to draw parallels between these different sort of changes that take place in very different levels, but I think there's a lot of similarities between them.
Right. And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but what kind of inspired or motivated you to write this book?
One of the questions that was fascinating to me for a long time is how we evaluate animal intelligence. And you guys probably have this experience already. A lot of people argue about whether their dog is smarter or their cat's smarter, right? So cat people think that cats are smarter, dog people think that dogs are smarter. How do we know which animal's more intelligent?
Mm-hmm.
And that was always a sort of fascinating question. I never had a satisfactory answer to that question. But I always thought that, you know, there's got to be some better way of understanding the fundamental nature of intelligence. So I've been reading a lot of sort of papers and books about intelligence, and they all say intelligence is the ability to solve complex problems. And some of the people will say that intelligence is the ability to solve complex problems in a variety of environments, because solving a complex problem is in one specific context, AlphaGo, who beats, you know, the Go champions and the Go world champions. I don't think it's highly intelligent, because it can do only one thing, and that's play the game of Go very well, but it obviously has no ability to solve other problems, and we don't consider those kinds of machines as highly intelligent. And then here's the main insight that I wanted to share with other people, and that is that that's still not good enough. In other words, you know, intelligence defined as an ability to solve problems under many circumstances still is not enough to define intelligence, because you have to ask the question as to for what? For what? Why are you solving these problems? Because that's going to determine as to whether you're going to, you know, you're going to accept the solution as a solution, because the solution to one person to a particular problem may not be a solution to another. And I realized that if you look at all the problems that either man-made or, you know, humans are man-made machines or humans are trying to solve, those are problems that life faces. You know, you'd like to find a good food, you'd like to find a good mate, you'd like to clean your environment. All of these are problems that are being solved for life. And that's when I realized that, you know, life and intelligence are like fundamentally linked together. And that was the main thing that I wanted to convey in my book.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. And so our final question for you is, we were wondering if you had any final advice for any high school students listening who really want to study neuroscience or apply to Johns Hopkins or Yale University.
Oh, I think that there are many exciting neuroscience programs and departments in the country. So, and then as I mentioned earlier, it really depends upon what kind of neuroscience you want to do. I have many regrets. There are many things that I wish that I had done differently, which is also very interesting. So, function of our brain. This is one of the questions that I cover in my book. There are many things that I wish that I had done differently earlier when I was a high school student, or when I was an undergrad student or graduate student. And at that time, it felt like I made a really, really serious mistake, that I'm going to be really, really handicapped because I did something wrong. And there are many cases where that thing that you felt that you're wasting time on can actually become your strength. So one example is that I studied decision making. And I happen to have studied economics as an undergraduate student. So when I was a graduate student, I never had written any laboratory reports when I was an undergrad student. And I had to I had to learn how to write my first lab report after going to the graduate school, which felt like a huge handicap for me. But then many years later, when I started studying decision making, and it's how the brain sort of makes decisions, the fact that I had spent several years in the college and took many courses in economics actually became a huge advantage, because most people in neuroscience never heard of, or they really don't know what utility function is. They're not familiar with the mathematical models of decision making and things like that. So this was a very unusual and in a way lucky sort of turn of events for me. And I think everybody's, I think Forrest Gump said that, life is like a box of chocolate. I think you'll see that many times. So whenever, as long as you have a passion in what you're doing, you shouldn't really worry too much about as to whether this is going to help me, 10 years later with my career or something like that. I think you should, you guys have a protected time. Students are protected. So you should utilize your time to try to explore your interest and to discover something that's really, really important.
Great, yes. And both as me and Sarah are high school students, we often find ourselves doing things specifically for college, but it's really important to just pursue things that you're interested in. So I definitely agree with that. And that wraps up our questions for you. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today for the College Neuro Network. Your responses were so insightful, and they'll definitely help any high school students listening who are researching colleges right now and are interested in majoring or minoring in neuroscience.
Thank you so much. It was so great to be able to interview you.
Thank you. Good luck.
Yes,
yeah,
thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.